Well, joining me now is former Liberal Democrat Minister Norman Baker and the Director of the Common Sense Society, Emma Webb. Norman, I'm going to start with you. I'm wondering, do you look across to the Dutch, for example, and do you fear the election of Geert Wilders happening in a country like ours if actually the electorate don't feel that they're being listened to on issues such as immigration?
Well, you know, Nigel Nelson made an important point, which is that our voting system is rather different to that in the rest of Europe, most of the rest of Europe. The Dutch system is one based on proportional representation, where small parties can secure a foothold. And, you know, this guy in Holland has secured, I think, only about 25% of the vote. It's not a huge majority. It's just the biggest party. Over here, you'll end up with just Labour and Tory winning seats, and the Lib Dems have got a foothold in certain parts of the country, so there'll be three parties, the SNP north of the border, a couple of Plaid Cymru MPs. But, you know, Reform UK won't break through, but Nigel says he can get 14, 50% of the vote. I think what the point Nigel didn't make, and I'm sure he would have made it, is that the fact of Reform UK is not on the number of seats, but on the Conservative Party, because what UKIP did was drive the Conservative Party to the right, particularly on the issue of Brexit. And I'd see Reform UK drive the Conservative Party to the right on this issue, because the idea that Tories could abandon the European Convention on Human Rights would have been out of the question 10 years ago.
Well, yes, but I mean, the Reform UK are now polling ahead of the Liberal Democrats. You must be a bit gutted about that.
Well, I mean, they won't get any seats, and the Lib Dems will. That's because of the voting system we've got, because the Lib Dem strength is concentrated in particular parts of the country, like north of Scotland and down the southwest. And actually, the other thing for the Tories, which you've got to worry about, is the fact that they can't reconcile the people on the far right of the Tory party, if I can call it far right, the red wall, if you like, who are concerned about this issue very strongly, with the people who vote Tory in the south of the country, who actually find it anathema we might break international law.
OK, I mean, Emma Webb, is that a label I can use to describe you? Would you describe yourself as the far right of the Conservative Party?
I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as being
I'm not sure many would.
Conservative,
yes,
but never mind on the far right of the party. I think it's just, unsurprisingly, the common sense position that, of course, Robert Jenrick is right, that if you have numbers of migrants coming in at these levels, you cannot integrate them, particularly because of the phenomenon that we know, that people tend to go to places where they know other people who are from the same villages back home and so on. So people congeal in particular areas, and then there is no integration, because what you end up with is what has been described as not multiculturalism, but plural monoculturalism. Lots of segregated societies living side by side, which is unsustainable if you want to have a cohesive society that can function. It's impossible to have a functioning democracy under those circumstances. I think, going back to what Norman was saying, that I see Reform as being kind of like the sheepdog. I'm not convinced on their policy for proportional representation, because I think there are very good arguments for the existing system. And I think that there are serious flaws when you look at other European countries that have PR. But what they do have the potential to do is be the sheepdog, is potentially cost the Conservatives so many votes over this issue that they are forced to listen to people in the party like Robert Jenrick, who I wouldn't describe as being on the far right of the party by any means. He's a sensible man putting forth a common sense position that I think the majority of people in this country would agree with. The polling time and time again suggests that the fact that people voted for the Conservative Party in 2019 on a promise that hasn't been kept suggests that we know the British people want to reduce migration. I think Robert Jenrick is absolutely right that Rishi's bill doesn't go far enough. And I think for many people, myself included, who look at this situation going on and on and on, dragging on, this is the best that we can do before the next general election. Well, we saw how, like that, it was possible for the government to crack down on our civil liberties during lockdown, but they can't seem to deal with this. So I think that the argument is being made sort of in the negative for leaving things like the European Convention on Human Rights.
Well, just briefly then, do you think, is that what's happening right now? He's laying the groundwork. He's going to be told, apparently there's a 50% chance that actually he'll be able to get planes off into the air, off to Rwanda before the next election. Of course, that other 50% says that actually the ECHR will say, no can do. And then Rishi Sunak makes that a central plank of an election issue come the next general election.
Well, it's 50% at best. So it's probably less than 50%, if we're being realistic. And the point that Robert Jenrick has made, which is quite right, which I think is why he said you're going to end up with this red-hot fury of voters against the Conservative Party backlash. If this is a campaign tactic on Rishi's part, which I don't think it is, I think it's a very poor one, because if as Robert Jenrick predicts, the implications of the current bill that Rishi is putting forth, which doesn't go far enough, if those implications play out, what we could end up with is a situation where, despite all of this legislative fussing that we've had over the Rwanda plan, that we end up with the flights being grounded by the European Court in Strasbourg for exactly the same reasons as the previous plane was grounded that kicked all of this off in the first place. It is absolutely unacceptable when our constitution dictates that Parliament should be sovereign, that we are not. What message does this send to the rest of the world? The United Kingdom can't control its own borders. It's absurd. It's a joke.
And actually, Norman, Gareth has written in and said actually there are a number of votes that used to be Labour votes going to parties like Reform.
That's true.
And that's the interesting conversation that ought to be had. I mean, are you in favour yourself of some form of proportional representation, the changing of the electoral system?
Well, I am, but there are different forms of PR. I mean, the PR system in Israel, for example, gives huge amount of power to one or two extremist religious parties. The PR system in Germany has worked rather well since 1945. So you've got to pick your PR system. But let me agree with Emma about the impact of sudden migration, which you may surprise us when I say that. But you have to grow organically, either as a town or as a country, and sudden influx of people, particularly from one part of the world, does make it more challenging. Look at somewhere like Suffolk and Norfolk, if you like, back in the 1950s, which were, at those times, sleepy backwaters of small medieval towns. And then suddenly in the 1960s, a whole lot of council seats bolted onto medieval high streets. And that took a very long time for that to assimilate and that to become a working place that actually worked as a town. Somewhere like Hadley, for example, I'm thinking, which I know reasonably well. So you've got to be slightly careful about this. But what the Conservatives have to answer, never mind the European Convention on Human Rights, is why it is that they were promising migration in tens of thousands by Theresa May in 2010. Why it was then the Brexit, we've now got 250,000, and now tripled by 3 times since Brexit. I didn't vote for Brexit, but people who voted for Brexit, I think many of them did so on the basis they wanted migration figures down. And they've tripled since then. So what is the Conservative answer to why it's tripled?
Yeah, well, that's a good point, isn't it? I'm sure.
Weird that we agree with
that. I never expected this, but there we are. Stranger things have happened, I guess. But there is a massive amount, actually, of people feeling that betrayal is the word that they'd use here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, if anybody goes and reads Robert Jenrick's article, he begins by saying that when he first went into his position as a minister, the first thing that he did was go and meet with a family in Dover that had their house broken into by one of these people who had crossed illegally. The reality is, particularly for those who are sort of ensconced in their ivory towers or in the sort of metropolitan liberal areas of places like London, like North London, that they're not coming into contact with this on a daily basis. Robert Jenrick quite rightly pointed out, school places, the NHS doctors' services, these things don't grow on trees. Housing, we have children in this country who are not housed in appropriate accommodation, and yet we have all of these people who are coming here with their first act in entering this country is to break the law, and we put them up in a nice hotel. I think people are very rightly angry about this because it is unjust. Very often the case made for being hospitable to migrants, even economic migrants, never mind refugees, is made on a kind of moral ground, that it's virtuous to be opening and welcoming to these people. But these things are always a balance. And actually, this is an injustice to the people in this country by putting their security at risk, by the extremely socially disruptive consequences of mass migration on this scale. And you're absolutely right. Over this Conservative government, it's just gone up and up and up. And that's not just the illegal crossings. That's also visas that we're giving to people that Robert Jenrick, again, has rightly pointed out, that there are things we can do about that, but the government has just chosen not to.
We're going to have to leave it there. Now, despite the fact that we all agreed like a nest of singing birds to some extent, there are other views out there, of course.
Hell's going to freeze over.
Yeah. But thank you very much to both of you for your time. I do appreciate it. That, of course, is Emma Webb and Norman Baker there of the Common Sense Society, and before that, the former Liberal Democrat Minister